I guess we'll start off just by saying, why are we here? So really, we're here to talk about science and literacy and that intersection and why we need to bother, and then how can we do it without putting too much extra onto our plates. So first thing we really want to look at is, what do I mean when I talk about literacy and science, or what do people mean when we kind of read into it or research? And really there's two things. There's literacy in science, which are the skills that students bring around their ability to decode the language. Can they actually understand the words you're using to explain the science? Can they actually break down those science words? Have they got those strategies? Whereas scientific literacy is really where we want to end up. We want students to have an engagement with the world around them. We want them to be able to be engaged citizens, interpret the world, interrogate claims, apply their knowledge and skills so they can make a better future for themselves. And that, to me, is what scientific literacy is. And although it's a fairly loose term in research, there's not a huge amount of agreement with the absolute specifics of the definition. Generally, across the world, and especially here in Australia, there is an agreement that the concept itself is really crucial. And I quite like that definition by Logren, Smith and Barry, who basically say that most uses of scientific literacy focus on that concept of engaged citizenship and the ability to interrogate what's being presented to students. That multidimensional idea where it's a human endeavour, but it's also taking it with a grain of salt and seeing what you actually think yourself, making informed decisions. So, I mean, trigger warning, we've all gone through COVID-19 and we've seen this. We've seen how there's a lot of public discourse around public health measures, around deciding for yourself whether it's right for the public, for yourself, for the economy, where we should go with using funds for different endeavours like cancer research versus multiple sclerosis research. But it's also, should I trust that Insta influencer who's talking about the new fad diet? So it comes up in all sorts of things. Does that engineering report for the house I'm building actually have everything it needs? Is the soil test something I understand with the concrete pouring slabs? Like, it comes up in so many industries, it comes up in so many avenues in everyday life that it feels like a truth, but instead of just agreeing with me, we also have the evidence for it. So the scientific literacy is where we want to get our students to. But before we can do that, we need that foundation of literacy in general, because that general literacy helps students get the scores on tests. It helps them study science. It helps them pursue careers. It helps them engage as citizens. So what we're going to look at today is that middle point. We want to end up with engaged, absolutely high-flying scientific citizens. So we're going to do that by looking at their literacy, because unless we get their literacy right, they're not going to understand, or they're not going to be able to engage with what we're teaching them. So, how? How do we actually do that without running out of time, filling in content, and losing our minds? We've come up with 15 activities that are fairly easy to differentiate for classrooms. They're pretty quick to organise, and I have personally found that they work really well. I'm not pretending to have made these up myself. Some of them I think I've probably combined with some other options, but a lot of them have just come from colleagues, from research, from experiences in the classroom as a student, as a teacher, as a person in life. So you will probably see that a lot of them trigger a memory in yourself, and absolutely they are there to be used as a guide and for you to really take them and make them what's useful for your classroom. Now, they've been broken down into 3 areas to help target some particular points of literacy need that I found are little sticking points for science knowledge and science skill building. And these are words, questions, and texts. Okay. Some of them might need a little bit more explanation than others, but please feel free to just jump in at any point and ask some clarifying questions if you need them. But otherwise, we're ready to go. Okay. So the first bit is understanding words, the base level. We know that science is a language all on its own. Some words can be a little bit tricky to decode, and some words actually have different meanings depending on the context. So we do already spend a lot of time working with vocabulary in science. And I found connecting back to what the students already know, so phenomena they've already experienced, words they're already familiar with, helps them to kind of settle that new vocabulary into their minds, and it makes it a bit easier to then use the new words moving forward. So the first task or the first activity, it's very similar to Taboo, if anyone's played that game. It's a list of words that you can't use to describe a key term. So, sorry, there we go. My screen was just being a bit silly. Okay. So you can do this in a number of ways, but the general premise is you've got a key term, you give that to a student, they've got taboo or not allowed words, and they have to present or describe the key term to their peers. An example would be using sedimentary rock, and you can't use the words sediment, sedimentation, compaction, or cementation. Whereas with gravity, maybe you say they're not allowed to use force, Newton, apple, or pull. And even by choosing what words you cancel out, you can change the differentiation or the challenge level for that student. So photosynthesis is going to be a lot harder to explain without the word chloroplast than if you allow them to have the word chloroplast, for example. Now, there's plenty of variations that you can do, and each of our activities are broken into the explanation, the example, and then some variations. So this one, I've found that timers and point allocation help the engagement factor, but it also helps to speed up the thinking process behind what they're doing. And that's useful in terms of getting students ready for tests and things like that, where they are under time pressure to come up with answers. The other thing we need to remember is literacy is not just reading and it's not just writing, it's also speaking and listening, communicating in different ways. So allowing students to draw or act instead of just verbally trying to explain is another great way of connecting some more skills up. Another thing you can do when we're breaking down words is to think about the morphemes. So morphemes are the meaning-making unit of a word. Bio for biologist, geo for geology, the ist on the end, meter, synth for bringing things together in photosynthesis. Okay. We already do break down key terms, especially for unfamiliar words, for big, scary science words like photosynthesis. But practicing the same strategy with less scary sounding terms also helps students to embed the strategy into their repertoire rather than only feeling like they are allowed to use it when it's a giant word. And by that point, they haven't got the basis of all the other ones to then break down that bigger word. So I would really recommend this just comes in at any point when you have a new term, whether or not you think it might be particularly difficult or not, because every time we practice that strategy, the better and the quicker the students become. The great thing about morphemes is then looking at the clues and talking about what the clues give us, what those parts of the word tell us. So this can be as simple as writing it up on the board and underlining one part and circling another and squiggly lining underneath the last bit, and then talking through what the sections mean for students. So do they already know that bio has something to do with life? Does someone already know that osteo has something to do with bones? Okay. Have you already gone through inflammation in a previous lesson? So they already go, oh, itis. Doesn't itis mean inflammation? And so they can work backwards to figure out what the rest of the word might be telling them. So the simplest way to do it, chuck the word on the board, break it down together. But you can also use it as a way of writing in glossary terms. You can prepare something where you jumble words up so you've cut them into their morphemes and you get students to put them back together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. You get students to create their own word out of these morphemes that you've spoken about. Might be a made-up word, but what are they wanting it to mean? So they're playing with the language and they're really investigating what the different parts are telling them. And it all means that later, if they do come to a word that they don't know and they don't have you there with them, they can go through this strategy and come back and go, well, if geo means that, if itis means that, then this word probably means X. And then they can move on and keep going rather than getting stuck. Okay. There's a couple of other things that I find really handy to do with morphemes. And this decoding cards task is really good. Printing out a set as the table shows, and then having students actually write into them. It develops a really good glossary. So the way it kind of looks is, all right, I've given them a word. The term in this instance is displacement. And I'm asking them to break down into morphemes. So dis, place, and ment. And then I'm getting them to give us the overall definition again, and I'm adding in a visual. So I'm using the morphemes to help build towards an understanding, and then I'm asking them to show it in a different way with the visual. Again, remembering literacy is more than just writing, it's more than just reading. So can they show it in that alternative to highlight whether or not they do understand what's going on? Some other ways you can do that is you can have some partially filled in cards and students have to work backwards. So for example, maybe I give them the visual and the parts, but the parts are jumbled and then they have to put it back together. So is the word placement dis? Is it meant displace? No, it's displacement. And even that interrogation of how it goes together helps them build their understanding. Okay. Some other ideas are that students choose their own words, so giving them that autonomy. they act instead of visualize. So the alternative way of showing it might not be a physical drawing. It could be an action, a movement. Okay. And as I said before, using this as a way to put your glossary together is quite handy. Okay. And we've got one more morpheme-based activity. So you may find that you start with the very first one, and as the students and as you get more comfortable with cutting up words, you start playing with them a bit more. You start coming down to the end here, which is growing words, which is making your own and having a little bit more of a comparison. So this one's really handy, especially when you've got words that use the same base, but have different starts and ends. So, for example, hypertonic, isotonic, hypotonic, okay? The tonic part is the same, and they're all such specific words that mean such a specific thing, but hyper and hypo students often get stuck and confused with. So making them go through this process helps them to really go, what is the difference? Where are they similar? Where are they different? For example, you've got the base of therm, which is heat. But you can chuck in a whole lot of different prefixes and a whole lot of different suffixes, a whole lot of starts and ends to change what that word is telling us. So we know it's something to do with heat, but what? Is it inside heat? Is it earth heat? Is it not enough heat? Okay. Is it about measuring the heat? Is it a disease about the heat? So working with the growing words process helps students to really see how we can build that vocabulary. And we go, I may have never seen the word exothermic before, but I know if I break it into those parts, I can go therm. I know therm. Okay. Something heat about. All right. It's about heat. What does exo mean now? And then they can work backwards with what they already know, the context of what they're reading and listening and doing. Okay. The really powerful part about this growing words is actually letting students have that time to go through it, to really talk about it, and to have that word creation. So if we go back to our example, an endothermometer may not exist, but even having students talk through the concept of, I've made this word, this is what I think it means, helps reinforce what the different parts are telling them. Okay. And there's always extra bits they can do, like put astro on the front of something. Does that make a real word? Does that make a non-real word? What could it mean? Let's take our imaginations and think, what would be an astrothermist? What would they do as a career? Excuse me. We also have other things that are not morphemes, if they're a little bit scary for you to start with. This is quick cross. It sounds a lot harder than it really is. You're asking students to write a crossword on a piece of paper, but to create the clues as well. If you don't have a printed out grid, that's absolutely fine. Sometimes I just get the student, I write one question, I write a big word across the board for the topic, and then I hand out textures and I go, right, let's see what else we can do. Let's see how many words we can connect together using the crossword rules. What I like to do with this one is give them some choice. So their clues might be definitions, might be fill in the blanks, could be pictures or synonyms. So really giving the students the opportunity to show their understanding and to test each other without only relying on definitions and words. Having them as an option, because sometimes that is just very useful, but really giving them ownership over showing their understanding in a different way. And this one lends itself really well to getting them to swap with each other and challenge each other. You can do different variations where you've got words that you provide, or one of the steps is for students to identify key terms for a given topic. You may actually give them a whole jumbled list of words and say you can only use ones relevant to forces, but you've given them the entire glossary for forces and ecosystems, and part of their work is to unpack that and to choose the words that are relevant. Excuse me. Or even to just sit and ask students to come up with 5 words themselves, or maybe one student can be challenged by including 10 and another student, an appropriate challenge would be to include 6. Okay, so there's always room to change the level of challenge with any of the activities, but this one has some really clean examples of how to do that. Me? And the last word-focused activity we have is what's that mean? Okay, this is really focused on when everyday meaning and science meaning of a word aren't the same. So weight or culture is used in everyday in a different way to how it's used in the science room. So I used to have a running record of these that we would have as a shared document. And whenever we came across a word that we realized actually didn't mean what they thought it meant or had a different use in a certain context, we'd pop it up in this document. And by the end of the year, it was big. But even being able to talk through that and giving students the license to not be wrong because their understanding of the word wasn't wrong, but to realize that context changes meaning was really quite a powerful thing and something they needed regular reminding of and permission to work through. So here's an example of some of the glossary terms that I would end up with. So medium, a lot of the time we'd get, well, doesn't that just mean average size-wise? In biology, it's what cells grow and feed on. It's usually the agar plate. In physics, it's something that energy transfers through. So they mean different things. So just thinking another way that we used this was after we had this created, we'd use it as a revision tool. So students would take the table and then create questions that prompted you to explain the term using the context of biology or of physics. But what they would have to do is make it so the question was obvious without saying biology or physics. So that comes into developing questions, which we're about to look at in a minute, but it does lead into that process. Excuse me. Something fun you can always do with words is see how many kids can put together in a sentence or a paragraph in a particular amount of time. And then whoever manages to get the most correctly used gets to leave class first, or whatever it happens to be. The moment there's that challenge aspect in there, I've found they're a lot more focused. Again, the visual side of things, because I often had this as a running record, wasn't as helpful to use audio-based or movement-based examples, but the visuals were often preferred by the students. So that's some word activities. Is there any questions at that point?
Yeah, please pop any thoughts, reflections, questions into the chat. Gives Felicity a second to drink the water as well. I love any where I think it can be a bit competitive or a bit fun. Like I think the one of inventing words, I think kids would love that. Obviously, you'd want to choose the class you do it with, because I imagine some classes could probably get slightly carried away. Also, as a former ELD teacher myself, like a lot of the ones, particularly like taboo, I can imagine using that really simplified for really basic vocabulary. So, not a question from Prue, but just a comment, Felicity, that she's loving the examples so far, though. So it's incredibly helpful. So
Thank you.
I say we press on, because it is also 4:31 now. So it doesn't look like anyone's asking questions. So we'll let you keep going, and
Okay.
if people have questions, we can pause again and see how we go.
Beautiful. Thanks, Quentin. All right, so we'll go into understanding questions now as a next kind of focal point. It's a key part of science, is to be able to ask the right questions, to go, I want to find out about this, or why does that work the way it does? And then, but then also to understand what questions are asking of you. So if you've got a test or an exam, what are you actually expected to talk about in response to that question? But then in terms of skills, it's that hypothesizing, investigating, and just generally being interested, engaging with the world around us. So I absolutely love nutshell sentences. I use it all the time, and it's forcing a summary more than anything else. It's a great layer of challenge to throw on the end of pretty much any question, and paring back the noise of examples or just students restating things or reading verbatim from the book or their notes. You go, all right, answer the question, and now rewrite it in 20 words or less, or different challenge levels, 30 words or less, or 15 words or less, whatever works for the student that you have. I found that doing this regularly helps students get to the point quickly, which gives them more time on tests to tackle the harder analysis style tasks, but also it means that they get to the crux of the content point quicker, and they really hone in on what is actually important, because there's a whole lot of stuff that we use in science to explain and to help make sense. But at the end of the day, the fundamental point can often be 20 words or less. So it could look something like this. The prompt question is, what is the first law of motion? And the standard answer talks about Newton's body at rest will stay at rest, moving at constant speed and direction will stay at constant speed and direction, unless something acts on it. But in the nutshell sentence, because they've got less words, the student has to use their own language, their own explanation. So they can't just rely on what you've just written on the board or what's in the textbook. And they end up saying something like, everything stays as it is, moving or still, unless an unbalanced force acts on it. Okay. They may even get to under 10, which is everything stays the same until it doesn't, which is something I've seen before. and they're not wrong. So being able to talk through their answers, their nutshell answers, even if you would want them to add an extra little point in somewhere, you can talk through that. You can say, well, let's say next time I want a 20-word or less nutshell sentence with 2 key terms being used or with this phrase included. So you can help lead them into quick, individualized answers that still include all the information that you're wanting. And at zero preparation required, throw it on the end of pretty much any question ever. So again, lots of variations. We can word limit change. You can ask them to add visuals where they think were necessary. So they're really starting to think about that communication part, or what can I show in a visual and therefore don't need words for, which is also really handy when we think about the science poster where we've got word limits. Okay. Or modeling, so using flowcharts and other kinds of models rather than a big paragraph worth of text. Excuse me. Talking about marking schemes, especially by the time you get to year 9, year 10, students seem to be ready to talk about what do I need to do to get those 3 marks? And so using the nutshell sentence going, well, you've got 30 words and you want to get 3 marks. What are we going to do here? Okay. Lots of different options. Another thing we can do is perform science. So really getting that movement happening. We can't always do a prac, but a lot of the time we want to be out of our seats. So how can we perform science in order to respond to a prompt? So how can we define a key term but without using written definitions? And this can be really fun. So this can be as a brain break, or it could be a full-blown project. It just depends on your class, how you're feeling, what the topic is, how much time you've got, and all the rest of it. But this is really good as a catch-all. You can use it in so many different ways. So our example is, what is axial tilt, which is, for anyone sitting there going, I don't know, what is it? It's the slight angle on which Earth rotates, and that's why we get seasons. Now, this particular student has chosen to do a silent mime where one of them is spinning around normally like a ballerina and their partner's going, not right. And then they go on an angle and they start spinning around and their partner goes, big thumbs up. Because all they're really trying to do is show that it is on a slight tilt and it is spinning around that tilt. Okay, so it can be as simple as that, or it could be a lot more involved, like maybe they're radio presenters for ABC Kids Science Show or wherever their imagination takes them. Okay, it's going to be individual, small group, big, short, however you want to do it. The other thing to think about is this can become a really strong communication task where honing in on who their audience is and why they've made decisions about their performance really helps build the communication around science concepts. So again, that's literacy because it's speaking, it's listening, it's presenting information. Okay. If you've got the time, getting students to collate their presentations and putting them as a quiz. So no one knows what their question or their prompt was except that particular group, and the rest of the class has to try and figure out what on earth they're talking about. So this ballerina, what is it trying to present as a concept? So that's always a bit of fun on a Friday afternoon. Okay. Poorly explained is a little bit like nutshell sentences. So getting to the heart of what the question wants, but with a bit of reverse psychology. So you respond to a question that's in a way that's technically correct, but you do it really bad. So you try to be confusing, you try to be misleading, you try to be vague. And then their partner has to try and figure out this confusing, vague, misleading answer has come from a question, but what question is it? And then they have to create the proper answer and talk about why that one helped fix the problem. Sorry, my lights have gone off. So here's an example where the prompt question is, what is a living thing? And the poor answer is, it's a thing that can move. The proper answer is talking about, Mrs. Gren, about all the different indicators of life. So respiration, sensing changes, reproduction, excretion. So the things can move is misleading and vague because it doesn't have all the information they need. So being able to work through why one of the answers is better than the other, really powerful. Some great variations. So maybe they share their poor answers and then the rest of the class has to try and figure out what the prompt was and why it was poor or why it was great. Allow pictures, dramatization, answers. And keep going because it's 22 already, goodness. All right. Another one is question starters. So this is really good for getting students to write their own questions. It's great for a check-in, a comprehension on texts that you're asking them to read, whether it's a prac report, whether it's an activity instruction, whether it's a research article for science as a human endeavour, and you can choose the levels that you work with. So there's, literal, inferential, and evaluative. What you do is you give the students a table like this with the starters, and the students fill in the actual question, the group question end section. For example, in a state change practical with literal starters, you'll get questions like, whose method was the most reliable? What was being tested? So they're really looking at answers that can come straight off the page, questions that can be really, really clearly answered directly from taking information from the text. Your inferential starters are more about why and explain and the relationships that are going on. So, for example, in a friction car practical, why did some of the cars slow down? How did the oil affect the results? Okay, so this is making connections between different parts of the text and things that the students know or observe. Evaluative starters, are really talking about what is the author or the data saying and how are they doing this. So do you think, do you agree, why, what would happen if you were the Minister for Agriculture, what would you do? Okay, so these really tend to look at science as human endeavour or the ethical and moral style science texts, but they also do talk about, for example, your scientific poster. Why did you choose that data to present? How is that helping get your message across? Okay. So lots of things you can do with these. You can mix and match. So a group of students might get some literal, some inferential, some evaluatives. You may want to start some students just at literal and build them up slowly. You can absolutely add more prompts than just the ones that are suggested here. There's so many you could choose from. Excuse me. You could also ask students to rephrase their questions to avoid the starter prompts. So they're really practicing that skill of creating their own questions from the very start. All right. And then we've got Teach a 6-year-old, which is another kind of question answer process. You may know it as explain to an alien, which I've come across a lot as well. And the idea is taking away all the assumed knowledge, starting at the very beginning of a concept and trying to figure out how to explain something simply. So we're taking away the higher order literacy issues of using specific scientific terminology. And we're going, if you explain this to a kid in prep or presentation or whatever it might be for the 6-year-old, how are they going to understand it? You can't use words like photosynthesize because they don't know what that means yet. Okay, so really looking at the analogies, and the students with higher order literacy really have fun with this because they can deep dive into analogies. And those students who find language a little bit more challenging, in my experience, really love this task because they feel like they're on an even playing field. They're not expected to be using that higher language. For example, what's a chromosome? Instead of our normal answer around eukaryotic cells and condensed histone proteins, we're talking, it's like a thin piece of spaghetti wrapped around a fork to keep it from going everywhere. Okay, so really connecting back to the things that they already know about. Lots of ways to play around with this, the pair share twist. So you have a partner who pretends to be the 6-year-old and constantly asks why until you think they might actually understand now. You got comparing answers between groups to see what have you all really focused on, and then going, well, that's obviously a key point about this concept. Comparing the normal and the 6-year-old answers. And again, having the answers and then working backwards to what the question might have been. All right. Are there any questions, clarifications needed before we move on to breaking down text?
There's nothing yet in the chat, Felicity, but we'll just give people a second.
Yep.
But I like that last one. I could certainly see how you'd use that, even thinking of something like exam prep with senior years. Like, what a great way to just kind of have a little bit of a brain break, but then just reinforce really important vocabulary that might have been covered for a unit or something like that. There's a couple of people typing. Well, I can see Sally perhaps typing a question. So. Sally just said she's just processing all the ideas. So yeah, it is a lot. There is a lot here. But as we said, we're going to send this slide deck out. You'll have it fully editable. You can share it however you want. We're recording the session. So yeah, if it's a lot that we're running through today, you'll have it all to review later. So no other questions, Felicity. So let's press on.
I know. I'm sorry, Sarah Lee. There is a lot, but I feel like if we say it all now and you can walk away with it, then it'll slowly work its way into your classrooms. All right, but we don't have too many to go. We are now up to number 12. So we're looking at decoding texts now. And that's really handy because it's about actually being able to read anything that gets put in front of you. So Is it trying to work out where the instructions are on a cooking website, or is it about figuring out what the aim of a prac was? Is it working out what the author is trying to get us to do at the end of a research article? So how do I actually work my way through a piece of text? And for students, often that means, how do I read my textbook? And that can actually be a really challenging task, because some go left to right, some go down in columns, some go down in columns and then kind of shuffle over to the side, trying to be all very fancy and beautiful. Where do the captions live for graphs and things? So actually being explicit in how to work with the textbook, I find, is really crucial, especially for students who don't have particularly strong strategies and skills in literacy, or they don't feel particularly confident in it. So the first one we've got is headings, please. It's quite simple. You give the students their text, but without their headings. So you take off the chapter heading, you take off the subheadings. Depending on the level of challenge, you may take out the figure headings for pictures and diagrams and graphs. And then you get students to try and figure out what they were. This is fantastic, not only for working out what goes where, so the sequence of your ideas, but actually what the key ideas were in the first place. So the headings are meant to be your key points. So in a way, they're your dot points for your revision summaries, as well as just, this is what we're actually wanting you to understand. And the moment students write that down themselves and apply it to something themselves, the more likely they are to remember it and to actually understand it. So it can be as simple as scrubbing it out in paint after you've screenshotted and putting it up on the board and talking through it as a class, or if you have time, going through and getting copies and providing copies for each of the kids. Okay. Sometimes, depending on the students I have, I might actually give them the missing text. So I'll give them what the headings were, just out of order, and then it takes one step away in the challenge level, and then they can go, well, that makes most sense in this section, and that title makes most sense for that diagram. So it's, especially if you feel like you don't have time for them to work through that part of the task, you can give them the text that's missing, just jumbled up. A really good thing also is to have them compare their answers with each other. So did they all come up with the same headings, or were they all different? That's really powerful conversation. Or you can actually delete the paragraph, just keep the headings, and see if you can get the kids to write in the paragraph information, see what they come up with. Another really great decoding text option is the human interest story. So really focusing here on a science as a human endeavour aspect, especially for a new topic. I found this was a great engagement tool at the beginning to get buy-in, because usually we wait to the end of content learning to bring in the she, but if you flip it and bring it in at the start, you get the text decoding practice as well as prior knowledge information. And you get a bit of student ownership about what they're interested in. It tells you what kind of examples or connections they might like to hear about as you go through the topic. Even if they are a little bit left of field, it gives you an idea of what their misconceptions are, what their interests are, as well as getting them to have some idea of where the topic is about to go. So what we're doing is we're asking them to annotate and summarize. So we're going, here's a text. What is this text about? What do you think this text means for the topic we're about to do? Okay. You can always complete it at the end, and so it's more of a summative thing rather than a formative thing. You can get students to write their own human interest text just with the heading of the topic at the beginning or at the very end to bring things together. You can get them to translate the piece of text into a poem, into a story, into a cartoon strip. So there's lots of different things you can do with this to get them really engaging with what the text is meaning, what's the core components, what's the core content it's trying to teach them or tell them, and where does that lead them into the topic they're about to do. Me. We've got sorting key ideas as well, which is where you take your text, you cut it up into chunks of key idea sections, and you ask students to figure out what they are. So I usually put the text into a table that you can see on the left-hand side. And in this case, they're paragraphs, but you might cut up a paragraph into single sentences. And then you give them the key ideas, but they're jumbled, they're out of order. So students might just get texture and arrow, do a bit of mix and matching as to where they think the key idea and the text comes together. Or you may get a new challenge level, which is they've got to work out the key idea themselves, or you just give them the key idea and they've got to work backwards in a larger text and find the section that it belongs to. Really handy if you do it on computer rather than printouts. Takes a lot of prep time out of your day. And you can use it as a formative thing before reading, so they get an idea of what's going on, or as a summative task, closed book revision, create their own options, challenge a partner. There's heaps that we can do here. And lucky last, unjumble my text. This one is worth the preparation. Help students practice reading text by putting one together. They've got to work out the flow of ideas, what goes where, what goes with what. Does the caption go with that diagram, the title of a graph? Where does my big heading go? Where does my medium-sized heading go? Where do these dot points go? Where does that flowchart end up? So it's heavy-duty comprehension and organisation, but it feels like a jigsaw puzzle. So it's a lot lighter in feel than it is in cognition. So it's a bit of they don't realise how much work they're doing. So I like it. Okay, so an example is like this. So on the left, you've got the original text, which in this case is a prac report, and the jumbled text on the right. All the bits are there, but they've got to cut and paste and put them back together in the right order. So they've got to read it. They've got to look for the signals in the text about who goes where. So some of the variations is how much you cut out and whether you leave some bits in their original position, whether it's a read text or an unread text that they're dealing with. Excuse me, only jumble the headings, make the class challenge about who can find errors the quickest. So it looks like it's correct, but you've actually put the headings in the wrong spot. See who can find out the problems. They love to correct the teacher. So if you say you did it accidentally, they'll be right on board. Okay, and that's our 15 strategies. It was a lot to take in, so I appreciate everyone listening so keenly and for so long. As I said, there's a lot to go through, but you take any of these and you make them for your own class and they should feel like you've been doing them forever because you will have been doing some of these already. So yeah, thank you. Is there any questions?
Thanks, Felicity. I will just wait for questions. We've got some comments coming in. So Prue says, this was amazing. Thank you so much. A lot of great insights and practical examples. Thanks, Prue. I know myself listening, Felicity, I was just thinking like a lot of these strategies that you've been talking about are applicable, you know, all the way across like all year levels, really. And you can, like, there's so many variations that you were talking about that you can make things more challenging or make them a little bit more accessible. So
that's it. Like year 7, they're a brain break and they're a fun Friday afternoon to get used to the concept. And in year 12, they're exam preparations. Like
exactly,
they've got a lot of options.
Lots of thank yous coming through. Someone said excellent for casual days. I'm so looking forward to adapting these ideas accordingly. Lovely. Thanks, Prue. Lots of thanks coming through still. And we've got some more people. To anyone that does need to jump off, I will just let you know that, as Clinton said earlier, we will be sending out the slides for you so that you can share them with your colleagues and look back over all of these strategies that Felicity shared with us. So keep an eye out in your inbox for an email from us early next week.
Also, just on the end of your slide deck, if you do feel like some light reading, we've got some references and links to resources in case you want to look a bit deeper. A lot of those have some examples of activities as well.
Amazing. Still lots of love coming through for you, Felicity. Thank you for the great ideas. Love the performing science. Yeah. I know that I've made my students act as atoms before, and that's always gone down well. Lovely. All right. I think that seems to be a wrap. Thanks, everyone.